Good morning, everyone. I'm sure there'll be some individuals still joining us in the days ahead, or in the hour ahead, sorry, but I just wanted to kick off. First, an introduction. My name is Lindsay McDonald. I am the Chief Executive at Magic Breakfast, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this magic morning. A couple of housekeeping items before we start. We are recording the webinar, so that means that you can play it back, you can share it with colleagues. We'll send it out after the event and it will be uploaded to YouTube so that people are able to access it. Also, I'm sure lots of you are aware of this, having had now loads of practice on the online forum circuit, but we've got a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we would encourage you to put any questions that you might have for the speakers and as we progress through the morning, and we'll come back to those at the end of the session. If some of them are maybe more specific or particular, then we can also pick those up directly with individuals after the webinar. So just a joy to welcome you all here today. First of all, for those of you who maybe don't know Magic Breakfast, we are a national charity. We have been in existence now for 20 years, and our mission and vision is to ensure that no child in the UK is too hungry to learn. And unfortunately, this situation, this challenge, is one that's not just present and prevalent, but it's also worsening. We had the COVID pandemic, which saw inequality heighten and increase. We saw children and young people, particularly those from more disadvantaged areas, start to fall back on their education and learning, which, as we know, is going to have detrimental impact on their later life chances and future potential in school and work and further career. But more importantly, we now face a national crisis in terms of the cost of living. And while that's not the purpose of today's conversation, I think it is important to note that actually the data and the findings that we're sharing were captured at the end of 2021. And so it really was before, I suppose, the bite of cost of living was affecting families and also affecting schools. And we've got some great panelists today, including a head teacher and assistant head teacher who might be able to bring to life some of the specific challenges that are currently being faced by schools, but also the impact and the reason why at their school in particular, for example, they are making sure that breakfast remains on the agenda and on the day for every school child. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, the reason for today's webinar is to share with you our Hidden Hunger Report. It is the UK's largest piece of research into breakfast provision. We're delighted to share it with you. We know that there are about 2.6 million children living in households that are experiencing food insecurity at the moment. But what we wanted to understand better as an organisation was, where is breakfast provision happening? How does that align with the need that we know exists in disadvantaged communities? And are we successfully reaching those who need it most? Two key elements in terms of answering those questions around breakfast provision and whether it's accessible to children and young people who are at risk of hunger was understanding what barriers exist, not just to children and young people, but also to schools. Why might a school not be able to or choose to introduce breakfast provision, given the wealth of evidence, which we've shared in past Magic Mornings, around the impact that that can have, not just on a child's future life chances and attainment levels, but just in general classroom behaviour, classroom management, and day-to-day life in schools. So understanding what the barriers were, we identified and looked at an entire national map. So Pete, my colleague, is going to speak a little bit more around some of the data collection, but in summary, what we did was a lot of Freedom of Information Acts. I think one of the key things to set out at the beginning is that this hadn't been done before. This data, this information wasn't known, and that includes to charities like Magic Breakfast, who are delivering breakfast every day, but also to government, who are funding and commissioning and looking to tackle child hunger in classrooms. So the research found that the majority of schools do have a breakfast provision, in the UK about 80%, and in England specifically about 82%. However, and very disappointing, school provision primarily and mostly have barriers in place, particularly barriers that exclude or prevent access by those most vulnerable and disadvantaged children. What we mean by barriers, and I think it's always kind of important for us to get beyond the jargon, what we might mean by barriers is cost. So that might be cost in terms of children and families taking part in breakfast provision, or a limitation on the number of free spaces that are made available. It's often in terms of that free places that are given, provided, or quite narrow targeting. And there's been quite a lot of conversation in the media in recent days around the eligibility and the narrow eligibility, for example, of free school meals. So things like that absolutely impact on the barriers that are put in place around breakfast provision as well. So what this does is it reduces uptake by pupils who need it most, because it doesn't have a focus on hunger. And I think that's one of the key premises of Magic Breakfast model, is the fact that our model is about being hunger focused, it's stigma and barrier free. Over the past 20 years, we've developed a model that aims to remove the practical barriers of cost, and that's achieved primarily through our economies of scale. This morning, for example, about 216,000 children and young people had access to Magic Breakfast provision. We're working in just over 1,000 schools across England and Scotland. We also are able to reduce our cost per breakfast through partners with some of our food suppliers, some of whom I think are on the webinar this morning, and who we hugely appreciate for their support. We also support and challenge and work alongside our partner schools. And that's about identifying ways for them to really leverage and maximize their staff resource, and how to best use their space to improve pupil uptake. So that's a really practical aspects of removing and reducing barriers. As well as being hunger focused and barrier free, we absolutely advocate and support schools to create that stigma free breakfast provision. And a lot of that will be done either around how the breakfast is provided, how targeting is enabled, or even in some instances, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit with Woodhouse Primary later on, about more universal provision where any child or pupil in the school is able to take up a breakfast provision. So all of these interventions have been shown to make a difference. One of the things that we found in the research report that we were both heartened by, but also recognized the amount of work we still have ahead of us, is we found that on average, a Magic Breakfast school has an uptake of 209 pupils attending their breakfast provision, compared to a national average of 44 pupils. Now, the pupils that are attending Magic Breakfast are overwhelmingly those who really do need it, who are coming to classroom, experiencing hunger, and would otherwise be unable to concentrate and learn or benefit from the excellent teaching that we have in the schools. What we also found is that schools without provision, the barriers that they cited really came down to primarily cost and, I suppose a related point, staffing. And this has been made even worse and exacerbated by COVID. And we see this likely to worsen in the months ahead as schools again grapple with rising fuel and other costs in terms of inflation. This is particularly an issue for schools that are or face particularly high levels of disadvantage in their communities, because they have experienced greater real terms decreases in terms of their funding levels, their budget, and are now struggling, as I mentioned, with rising costs as well. So if we look at what these gaps in provision mean for children and young people who are experiencing disadvantage, the research suggested and found that in England, for example, as many as 2.7 million, or 75% of children and young people who are defined as being disadvantaged by the government could be missing out on breakfast. We have another session specifically speaking to trends in a few weeks' time, which if you're interested, please do get in touch with us. And that's looking at the trends identified in Scotland. And in the report, you'll have seen that we also set out the landscape in Wales and Northern Ireland. But while we don't deliver service delivery there, we've chosen not to include that in this morning's webinar. So without further ado, I know many of you have joined for the detail and for the kind of findings of the report. I will introduce now my colleague, Pete Whitehead. He works on our policy and public affairs team, and he's going to take us into a few, I'd say, deep dives of regional data and a couple of case studies that hopefully bring it to life at a community level. So Pete, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. So yeah, I'm not going to go into every region because we would be here, I think, all day. So I'm just going to do a couple of case studies that I do think kind of illustrate quite well some of the findings we've got. So one of the things we considered when looking at the regional data was whether there was correlation between levels of disadvantage and breakfast provision. And we found that generally in England, where there was higher levels of deprivation, there was higher levels of provision. That's a positive thing to see, especially given that in some areas, like Scotland, there just didn't appear to be the same correlation. So in England, the more deprivation we see, the more likely you are to see breakfast provision. But as outlined by Lindsay, having provision doesn't always mean that children and young people who need it can actually access the provision. So high coverage doesn't necessarily mean it's targeting the children and young people who need it most. So this is the first example from our data that I want to use. In Hartlepool, our sample suggests that excluding our partner schools, 91% of schools in Hartlepool have breakfast provision. Now, that's obviously a good thing, but just around 14% of that is barrier-free. So the remaining 86% of provision has either limited spaces, costs attached, or doesn't exist at all. So capped places obviously limit access. And we know from our experience that even what seems like a nominal cost, £1 a day, for instance, can be a serious barrier to families, particularly now, given the cost of living crisis. The best provision in terms of reaching children and young people who need it is a barrier-free provision. That's just a picture for Hartlepool, but this situation of gaps kind of exists. Thank you for this. Thank you. You'll notice throughout the following slides that total provision, which is generally indicated in blue, is always going to be larger than the area representing free provision, which I've indicated in a sort of dark yellow. And that's the crux of the problem. So to take the Northeast as a region, 88% of schools have some form of provision, but less than half of that is barrier-free at 45% of schools with provision. That's particularly concerning given the high levels of deprivation in the Northeast. Next slide, please. Thank you. We found that the Midlands broadly loses out in terms of breakfast provision. So the West Midlands has the lowest rate of coverage at 75%, and that means that 1 in 4 schools has no provision whatsoever. But the East Midlands, which is on this slide, is the region with the lowest percentage of coverage that's barrier-free. Just 20% of schools with provision have no barriers to access. So that means if you're a young person in this area, you've got a 1 in 5 chance of being guaranteed a meal before you start the school day, assuming your school has provision at all. Next slide, please. For all the sort of, talk of London, the Greater London region has the second lowest percentage of barrier-free provision. Just 23% of schools with provision have barrier-free provision. Its percentage of coverage in terms of overall provision is 80%, which is around the national average for England. The usual narrative around London's wealth simply does not extend too often to children in the capital. The reason that this is worth focusing on is one of the things we looked at was who is funding breakfast provision in schools. What our research found is that it is overwhelmingly schools themselves, followed by the third sector. Now, given the obvious constraints on school budgets at the moment, that's just not a sustainable model of funding. At some point, something is going to have to change. Next slide, please. So how can local authorities help? In our report, we make some recommendations for national government. The primary one, of course, is to properly fund breakfast provision with a funding model that's fit for purpose and sustainable. It's a national problem, and I think the overall solution will be national action. But right now, there's some really, really crucial work that can happen at a local level. So the 2 recommendations we make are as follows. The first is to use local resources to identify breakfast cold spots. Local authorities can act now to map and to fill gaps in the areas of highest disadvantage with the least provision. If you'd like assistance on mapping this, or you'd like to talk about our data, please do contact us. We are more than happy to help. Just let us know. And we're aware actually that GIA, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, I think is one example that's doing really, really great work on this. We think that where possible, local authorities should work with the third sector, with businesses and with breakfast providers to come up with local solutions and get resources to reach more children. And the second recommendation is that local authorities and councils themselves should make the case for fully funded national provision. No one knows your area, and I know it's a well-worn cliche, but no one knows your area better than councillors do. And the councillors' voices are incredibly important in making the case for a national funding programme. If you'd like to, so that's it from me in terms of the data. I didn't want to go sort of into everywhere because I suspect I would be here all day and bore everyone to tears. But if you'd like to discuss the findings of the report, which the report we shared after this meeting, or discuss the findings for your region or area, drop us an email. Myself and my colleagues in the data team would love to chat, and it'll be easier than pulling up individual areas live on this webinar. We also have campaigning activities going on at the moment. So if you'd like to get involved with any of our national campaigns or lend us your voice, we would love to hear from you, and I'd love to put you in contact with my campaigning colleagues. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Pete. And just to reiterate and echo Pete's point in terms of, please do get in touch with us directly if there are particular case studies that you're interested in learning about. And also just a reminder to add any questions that come up throughout the presentations in the Q&A section as well. So really excited and delighted to be introducing our next two speakers, who are the head teacher and assistant head teacher at Woodhouse West Primary School, Anne-Marie Bailey and Keely Kristen. The school has been a partner with Magic Breakfast since the beginning of this year, but by all accounts have gone absolutely from strength to strength. Our school partner Michaela sent a glowing review in terms of just the passion, the commitment that you show, not just to enabling and ensuring that that breakfast provision is there every day, but the real difference and the impact that it can make for your pupils. So really looking forward to hearing a little bit more about your journey with Magic Breakfast. Thank you both.
Wow, thank you, Lindsay. That's one introduction. We feel incredibly privileged to have been asked to come and join you today. Our school, as Lindsay just said, has really only very recently joined Magic Breakfast, and we have seen a lovely impact. We don't have huge amounts of concrete data just yet because we've put so new to the whole process, but we do have a lot of lovely anecdotal information which we're hoping to share with you. So my name's Anne-Marie Bailey, I'm the head teacher.
I'm Keely Kristen, the assistant head.
And we're hoping that what we share with you today will be useful. So could we have our first slide, please? Lovely, thank you. So this is just to give you a little bit of an idea of what we look like. This is our school as seen from the approach road. We're based in Sheffield, which is in South Yorkshire, and we sit in an area of reasonably high deprivation socially, which means that we have a really large demographic of children who have very, very mixed backgrounds with very, very different starts to their day. We're extremely proud of our school. We are in a city, as I've just said. However, you can see partly in that photograph, we do have a lot of green space that attaches to our school grounds, which makes us quite different to some other inner city schools. And that forms a huge part of what we do as a school in terms of the way in which we run our school day and use our curriculum. We think that children being outside, being in the fresh air, having that green space to be in is very, very important for their well-being as well as for their development. And so we try to use that to its absolute maximum capability as much of the time as we can. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of context for the school, we are part of the Sheffield South East Trust, which is a very small MAT, a multi-academy trust of schools, and we have around about 390 pupils. We do have quite a lot of what's called pupil migration, which means we have new children coming to join us within the school year, but we also have children who go off to move to different parts of the city or who leave us for other reasons. So that number does vary reasonably dramatically during the year, and can be more and can be a little less than that at different times. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we have a very high percentage of children who qualify for free school meals. 50% is significantly above the national average. We also have about double the national average amount of children who are on the SEND register, so children who have additional needs and require extra support in order to access the curriculum. 2% of our children have what's called an education healthcare plan, and that means that they have sufficient need that they require a lot of additional support, not just from our professionals within school, but from outside agencies who add extra to their development, whether that's to do with speech and language, whether it's physical or cognition difficulties, or social, emotional and mental health issues. They can all be part of that need that would create an education healthcare plan. Our numbers of children who have English as an additional language are now rising. We were previously a school that was predominantly white British, but we now are very pleased to say that our cultural mix is really developing and increasing, and we have lots more children with English as an additional language and lots more children who are BME within school. That's brilliant. We've been waiting for children who are going to increase our cultural mix in school for a while, and now we're really starting to see many more of those children coming to join us, which is another part of our children's development that is important. We think that our job is not just to help children academically to improve, but to be holistically improved. So as little people, we want them to be ready to go into the world and become really good citizens who can contribute and to make really valuable impact on the world around them. And part of that is to be very aware of everyone else, to be empathic and to be supportive. And that's, you know, part of what we do. So here are some of our children. We thought you might like to see them and see some of the things they get up to in the day. You can see in the centre there a photograph of them enjoying some of our lovely green space. Our children go on lots of residential trips. They have lots of visitors into school. Being with their parents as part of that learning journey is very important for us as well. You can see at the bottom there's a photograph of one of our children with his mum working on some physical fine motor skill activities there. Reading is really fundamental to everything that we do in school, and you can see there are several photographs of the children on World Book Day. You can see one of them there, bless him, who is acting out a character from one of the David Walliams books in his aeroplane, bless him. And you can also see that environmental work is very important for us. So there's a project down at the bottom there where children were talking about the impact of plastics on our environment and the things that we need to do to try to control that. We're so lucky. Our children are creative, they're inspiring, they're sensitive, they're generous, they're insightful, they're very happy little people, and they're extremely polite. And one of the things that often people comment on when they come to visit us is how beautifully well mannered the children are. And that comes from an awful lot of input, a lot of nurture, a lot of cherishing from the staff within our school. Alongside those beautiful positive qualities, we do have children who bring with them a lot of baggage to school every day. So as a result of some of the things that they've experienced from birth to their present ages, they do have quite a lot of trauma. We are a trauma-informed school, so we have done an awful lot of training on the impact of trauma for children into their adult lives, and what we can do as staff to help children to be able to regulate their emotions and to be able to deal with some of the future repercussions of incidents or events that have happened to them in their very formative years. So I'm sure you will all have heard of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and we estimate that probably 70–75% of our children, that's conservative I would imagine, will have experienced sufficient ACEs to have an impact on their future lives. A lot of them have speech and language difficulties when they enter school, and we do a great deal of work with outside agencies to help them to overcome those barriers. We also work very closely with social care, with MAST, which is the multi-agency support team, because our school is not just focused around children, it's around their families. We strongly believe that children can only learn when they're in the right place to learn, both emotionally and physically. And that means we need to be very aware of who they are, what's happening in their lives, and their well-being in general. So these are some of our staff. They're not always completely crazy. A lot of the time, yes, but not always. They do like to dress up and inspire the children in different ways. You can see there are quite a few photos there of World Book Day where staff have gone a bit crazy with their outfits. And the photograph of the staff when you look at these, they do look hilarious. The photograph of the staff laying on the floor in the fields was part of some of our development, and learning how to really trust one another and be in the moment when we're working alongside each other to build that team approach. We're very lucky. Our staff are very special people, and they really understand the importance of knowing children inside out, knowing their family circumstances, and being aware of what might be needed for a child before they can even begin to start their education for the day. And really, that's where Magic Breakfast comes into play for a lot of our children. And we're going to talk to you in a bit more detail about that in just a moment. But there are several of our children who come to school not in a good state and who require additional time to just make that transition from home to school. And lots of our staff are part of that process to ease children from one environment to the other, and similarly at the end of the school day to ease them from school back into home. So how does that relate to breakfasts? Well, this is an example of what breakfast might look like for our children without the support that we currently receive from Magic Breakfast. So prior to Magic Breakfast coming into school, we have just opposite our school gates a little corner shop, which is very useful in some ways, but in other ways is something that hinders our children having a good start to the day. So you will notice on this little slide that there are a couple of empty plates. A lot of our children would come to school not having had breakfast at all. And quite often, if there are children who are in crisis in school, who are distressed, who are anxious, who are angry, and who are unable to start their day, when we speak to them, when we manage to put them into a place where they have regulated their emotions, one of the first questions we ask is, have you had anything to eat today? And very, very often the response to that is no. Have you had any supper last night? Often the response is no. Or for example, I had a conversation with a child yesterday who told me she'd got tummy ache. When I asked her about what she'd had last night for supper, she said, I had some cookies. So there are lots of things going on with our families where food is the part of their lives that suffers. So when there is insufficient money at home, the convenience is what comes into place. So I try to help everybody to understand this, and I hope this is in a simplistic way. If you don't have a huge amount of disposable money, you don't have the facility to get some of the resources that we take for granted. So I, like I'm sure most of you, when it comes to the end of the week, get in my car, I drive to the supermarket, I buy a week's worth of groceries. A lot of that is I'm buying in bulk because I have a family to feed. I bring it home and I put it into my fridge and my freezer ready to use throughout the week. A lot of our families don't have access to a vehicle, and therefore their only means of getting to somewhere to buy food is through public transport, which is not very easy, especially if you have 4 or 5 children, a couple of which are in a pram, a couple of which are toddlers and need holding hands, and a couple of which are teenagers who just don't want to be with you anyway. So getting to somewhere to purchase food is tricky, which means that they tend to rely on local shops. Local shops tend to charge more per item for the things that you buy. And what also happens is they don't have a chunk of money with them at any given time. So they tend to live from day to day, which means that they will go to the corner shop and they will buy sufficient food for the meal that they are going to have next, just one meal, which can be a very, very expensive way of doing that. Or they rely on the local takeaway, which of course, as we all know, is a huge amount of money for one meal for a family. If they were to be able to buy food in bulk, a lot of our families don't have access to freezers, and therefore that food is going to go off. So the things that actually create economy for us as families who might have more disposable income are the things that then make the situation worse for our families who have very little. So not being able to get to the supermarket where prices are cheaper, not being able to buy in bulk because you don't have the facility to carry that home with you, and or the storage once you get home, means that we tend to rely on very instant fixes. Next slide, please. So this is what we used to offer. We used to have a breakfast club in school. It was run in the school hall, and it was our catering staff who ran that. It was a paid service, and what was the outcome of that was that we had a few families who went all the time, but it was the same families, and they were families who generally could afford to pay for the breakfast that they were having. We ran alongside that a specialist transition breakfast for those children who had additional needs. But when COVID came, all of that had to stop. So we couldn't mix children from different classes together. We couldn't mix different families, and everybody needed to be separate. So for a period of time, we did offer breakfast to children in the best way that we could manage, but that was still a pre-ordered service, and it was toast that was delivered to the classroom doors. So again, it was only really accessing those children who could afford to have that breakfast paid for every morning. And it meant that we weren't getting to all those children who probably needed it most. Next slide, please.
So as the lead for Magic Breakfast, I've been able to work closely with Michaela Wild, our school partner, in order to be able to deliver Magic Breakfast that would best suit our children and our school. So we heard about Magic Breakfast initially through our trust schools who had already partnered up. And what we liked about it after our discussion with Michaela is it wasn't only giving us the opportunities to support children in accessing a universal breakfast provision, but it also Magic Breakfast aligned with our school visions and ethos. So the sustainability, the lack of waste, making sure that children had a fantastic start to the day to develop their social and emotional well-being. So we used the funds, which were invaluable, to be able to, for the startup cost, to buy the provision that we needed, such as freezers, plates, cutlery, to be able to deliver that provision. We were able to communicate with staff, parents and children that this provision was now going to be offered, and that piqued their interest and that got them excited. And then we were able to start our Magic Breakfast journey. So as you can see here are some pictures of some of our children enjoying Magic Breakfast. And like we've spoken about before, children generally at our school don't come to school with breakfast, or a very unhealthy choice. So the fact that the children can come together as a unit, it's offered to all children, mean that there's a really positive start to the day. As a school, we decided to support Magic Breakfast alongside a more well-being approach. So our children, when they arrive with us in the morning, are able to have a very light touch with an adult. They're able to spend time with the grown-ups in the classroom, the teacher and the teaching assistant, and they are able to talk about how they are feeling, which helps them to settle into the start of the day. Our older children are able to support themselves independently by making their bagels themselves, and our younger children are supported by the adults in the classroom. Just a few pictures here about how we prepare and set up Magic Breakfast. So again, you don't have to pre-order, it is universal. We make sure that we ask every child the day before to say whether they want a bagel or not. Then we get them out in the morning. Staff prepare them to start with, just for time approaches, just to make sure that it's not going on for too long. And then the children can come and help themselves to the recommended portion of bagel, but then we have the capacity to be able to feed children should they be a little bit more hungry. Next slide, please. So on average, 90% of children in each of our classes have a bagel each day, and that is a phenomenal uptake. And the children, the 10% that don't want a bagel, generally it's because they are the families that do have a more healthier start and a healthy breakfast choice at home. In addition to the children that don't like bagels, the fact that Magic Breakfast is able to support us in cereals and porridge, it gives us another avenue to make sure that a child gets that healthy start, a healthy breakfast choice. We also use the provisions provided by Magic Breakfast as part of the nurturing aspect of our school lives. So some of our children have increased appetites due to the fact that they're not eating at home as much as we would like. So we're able to have that stockpile of food items to be able to support those children. Just being a part of Magic Breakfast really helps us to provide not only during school time, but also during the holiday times as well. The fact that Magic Breakfast offers us the capacity and the ability to be able to offer food items during the school holidays has proven to be one of our more popular aspects of Magic Breakfast. Here are some of the feedback points that we've had from not only our parents, children, and one of our staff members who are our learning mentor. He provides the more nurturing side and works with small groups. And so he has been able to use the food provision that Magic Breakfast offers us to be able to start his groups and to be able to open dialogue and discussion to support the children's emotional well-being. Next slide, please. So obviously, as Anne-Marie spoke earlier, we haven't been a part of the Magic Breakfast family long. We only started in January, but what we can see already is that the number of children arriving late to our school has decreased. The fact that we can offer a breakfast provision means parents don't have to worry about feeding the child before they come to school. They can just pop them in their uniform, get them ready and out the door. Our persistent absentees have reduced from 182 children to 111, which for us as a school is a massive decrease, and we can only think that Magic Breakfast is one of the elements that we can say has supported this. The anecdotal evidence is that the staff are saying that children are more settled to begin their school day, and that teachers are reporting that children are more focused towards learning activities sooner in the day. So looking to the future, Anne-Marie.
We just feel that this is something that has been just wonderful for our school. We can't speak highly enough of Magic Breakfast in so many different ways, hence the overrunning. I do apologise, we've got so much to say. What we want to do in future is, once our doors are more open to parents and COVID restrictions have really disappeared, then we'll be able to bring whole families together in the morning to have Magic Breakfast with us here, and to be able to make sure that not only the children start their day well prepared, but their parents do too. And that's going to be even more significant with those rises in cost of living that we mentioned earlier on. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and a huge congratulations, 90% uptake. I mean, it can't be underestimated, the level of energy and commitment and focus that really does take. So stepping, I suppose, back from a school-focused and a child and family-focused case study and moving now to a local authority provider. I'm delighted to introduce Marcus Robinson. He is the programme lead at the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and he oversees food and community programmes. We've been working with Hammersmith and Fulham at Magic Breakfast for several years now, and really looking forward to hearing, Marcus, what you have to share from a broader community perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, and morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Marcus Robinson. I'm a commissioner at Hammersmith and Fulham. Unfortunately, we are running slightly over schedule, so I'm going to have to do a real whistle-stop tour, but I want to give the opportunity for some questions at the end. So as I go through, do put any questions in the chat so we can reach it. So I want to talk about the 3-year journey that Hammersmith and Fulham has had with Magic Breakfast. So back in 2019, the council was already quite concerned about the impacts of food insecurity, what that meant for the educational attainment for our children who were coming in to school hungry. And we were also seeing a couple of alarming statistics. One was work done by the GLA, which was saying that there was 200,000 children in London alone who are suffering from food insecurity. And we were also seeing our free school meal numbers, which had been persistently coming down for a few years, starting to creep up. And therefore the council decided to put some funding in to see what we could do to address food poverty. So next slide. And so the interventions that we looked to have were firstly, one which was a pilot of free school meals in a couple of our secondary schools, which is quite an interesting program. If anybody wants to get my contact details and speak about it afterwards, I'm happy to answer that. We also put in an innovation program, which actually became a lot of the basis of our COVID relief. We also looked to put in a free breakfast offer for all of our primary schools and nurseries. Next slide. So for the breakfast offer, we knew that we wanted to partner with an organisation which could provide advice as well as breakfast foods to our schools. So we had a competitive tendering process which we put out, and we got a lot of interest, perhaps predictably, from catering companies. But We also got this tender from Magic Breakfast, and actually the values which were talked about earlier today around having real hunger-focused provision and being able to target children who had educational healthcare plans, based on free school meals, or otherwise were vulnerable to food insecurity was really important to us. And just that vision of having no child too hungry to learn was really what we were talking about, of really wanting to support our children to take advantage of our schools. And Magic Breakfast brought that, as well as being able to supply food and also bringing a huge amount of experience to the space. Next slide. So the specification of what we wanted to actually achieve at the beginning, what we initially put out was that we wanted to create a system where all our primary schools could have free breakfast clubs for any people who wanted to access it. It would be free to charge for families, and in addition, we'd be offering schools advice and funding to establish this. Sounds okay. So next slide. What could go wrong? Well, as mentioned before, like our previous speaker, a lot of schools already had breakfast clubs, and some of these offered some free places, but largely was taken up by people who could afford to pay for breakfast clubs. And there was limited capacity in many of our schools to actually expand these. So if you made just a breakfast club free, then what you'd end up doing is actually just making free places available to families who could afford it, without necessarily increasing the reach to the families who really needed it. The other concern was that a lot of the families who needed it actually found it quite difficult to come into school early in the day. And so we wanted to create something which is a little bit more flexible, and also something which probably be less expensive than trying to cover the cost of all preschool breakfast clubs. Next slide. So the flexible offer we came up with working with Magic Breakfast was something which was a breakfast offer at the start of the day. That could be at the end of the breakfast club, but it could be also as children came into school at the beginning of the day. And we also offered all our schools in Hammersmith and Fulham a kind of option around whether they just wanted advice, whether they wanted the food deliveries from Magic Breakfast, and also the council offered schools additional grant funding. This would be to cover any additional startup costs, staffing costs of providing the breakfast clubs, and also to be able to purchase additional food. And we made this offer available to any primary school or nursery with no criteria about who could apply. There was no minimum criteria in terms of levels of needs or deprivation in the school, and there was no criteria about which children could access it. We feel that like a universal offer is really important in terms of being able to both increase reach amongst the target groups, but also reducing stigma of offer. Every school that applied would get a dedicated partner. The Magic Breakfast partners, I have to say, have been absolutely fantastic. Schools have had a huge amount of stress over the last couple of years, and they've said that the school partners have been really useful in actually being able to help them establish a breakfast offer quite easily and actually really being able to tailor it. The grant funding also helped them to supplement the Magic Breakfast foods. We gave out nutritional advice in terms of what additional foods could be purchased as well, and it's really helped enhance the offer as well. Let's go to the next slide. So we had quite a strong offer which was being established in our schools, but obviously the pandemic hit. We feel that we're actually really fortunate that we had set this up just really a few months before the pandemic hit. That meant that we could respond quite quickly, and Magic Breakfast very quickly moved to a system where we looked at how we could get food deliveries out while schools were shut for the majority of children. And so we had firstly breakfast being handed out by the schools, and then Magic Breakfast partnered with Amazon to be able to do home deliveries of packages. And we made this available again to all our primary schools. So last summer alone, we managed to reach 10,000, give out 10,000 breakfasts to families which schools had identified as being particularly vulnerable to food insecurity. So where are we now? So at the moment we have schools kind of back and hopefully slightly less disruption from pandemic. We have 22 schools who are signed up to this universal free school breakfast offer. That is the majority of our larger primaries and nurseries and most of the ones with higher need. We still have a few schools which haven't signed up, and they tend to be these kind of smaller schools or the ones with lower need. Last year alone, Magic Breakfast delivered 500,000 breakfasts to our school children, and in the schools which have established provision, even those which previously had some free places, they've seen uptake increase on average by 66%, and on average of the schools we're working with, they are reaching over half the children who are on pupil premium are getting that breakfast offer. And we feel that there's a lot more to go, and we want to be able to reach more, particularly in light of the fact that the concern that we had in 2019 of numbers have slightly gone up. Well, I mean, we were concerned then. I think everyone is feeling now that we've gone from the period in 2019 when nobody really talked about food insecurity to very quickly into pandemic, and so now food insecurity and COVID being the #1 issue which like people are talking about nationally and locally. Next slide. Just a quick thing on feedback. We did a survey of our schools last year, which they universally 100% agreed that the Magic Breakfast provision had helped to address food hunger in the morning. That it meant that children were now more likely to have a healthy breakfast, and that it actually helped to improve attainment and address some of the issues we had with lost learning during the pandemic. And some really great quotes again about the work of Magic Breakfast and the school partners. Next slide. So what's next for the programme? Well, firstly, as a local authority, we feel that the state of food insecurity in one of the largest economies in the world remains embarrassing, and we would reiterate what Magic Breakfast was saying earlier about wanting to see more regional and national responses to food insecurity and supporting national breakfast programs. However, until then, we have decided to extend the contract with Magic Breakfast, and we are seeing it as now part of our overall response to the cost of living crisis which people are facing, how this and fitting this provision in with things such as the household support fund to support households facing food and fuel crisis, and also things like our holiday program with food which we provide, and actually building this into an overall system in tackling food insecurity. So we're looking to build into that system. We also want to reach more schools. We want to increase the reach in those schools, and we are really looking forward to continuing this work with Magic Breakfast going forwards. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so, Marcus. And what I'm going to do now, just to re-invite everyone, and I know some have already come through, to send in your questions, and we'll deliver these to the various members of the panel. Can I have Anne-Marie and Pete come back on your screens, please, so that we've got other people to draw in to the various questions. But just a huge thank you first and foremost to all of the panelists. I think what really came through for me is, one, the absolute urgency for this work to be taken forward, and I hope and perceive the value of this type of mapping exercise to tell us where that need really is greatest, so we can align investment accordingly. But also what comes through really clearly from the two case studies in particular is around the people-centered approach being absolutely central to success and ensuring that pupil uptake. I think, Marcus, you touched on it very generously in terms of the great work that the school partners do, and similarly Anne-Marie and Keely, you touched on the work that you need to do as a workforce and a team in the school, not just to engage with pupils but also their wider families, to really make that holistic impact. So a very big thank you to you all. So if it's all right, Anne-Marie and Keely, I'm going to come to you in the first instance with a question around, I think a timely question, the cost of living challenges that pupils and families face. What more can be done, in your opinion, to firstly help parents further with education and helping them to understand the importance of breakfast in terms of unlocking that education? And then Marcus, if I could maybe come to you secondly and reframe that question slightly of how do you think we can create an understanding of the importance of breakfast provision on education for local councils and councillors and commissioners? So Anne-Marie, to you first, please.
In terms of further work to be done, I think for us as a school, certainly there's more communication around the impact of lack of nutrition on children's processing capabilities, so that low blood sugar level and energy levels and what that means in terms of concentration spans for children. A lot of our parents will understand the concept of being hungry, but not necessarily how that further impacts on their children's developmental processes once they're in the classroom. So that's something that we want to do, and to educate parents further in terms of helping with that. But our parents can see the difference in their children having had the breakfast, and lots of our parents will say it's so much easier for me now. I know that they're going to have their breakfast when they get to school. I know that they've got something in their tummies and that they're warm and they're talking with their friends whilst that's happening. So it's just extending that process, and by having families come to have their magic breakfast, that's a really good arena for us to be able to pass that information on. Our parents listen better when they feel relaxed, when they're in an environment where they feel unthreatened and they're comfortable. So that works in all different ways for us.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Marcus, I suppose the same question again, how do we make sure that local authorities and councillors and commissioners understand the impact and importance of breakfast provision and that attainment, and perhaps what more can be done to support families with the cost of living crisis?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. Firstly is understanding the relationship between local authorities and schools, which has changed quite significantly. And really it is about what I was saying is it's a relationship. And I think what we're hearing at the moment is actually a lot of concerns from our schools around food insecurity. As local authorities, we already invest quite a bit in terms of school improvement and what we can do to improve educational outcomes. And what we are seeing is like lots of local authorities who are looking at how can we support with these issues and how we can support with the overall cost of living crisis. Food was barely on the radar of local authorities 3 years ago. However, now local authorities have spent a couple of years actually with funding and some priorities around tackling cost of living and providing COVID relief. So there's been some experience, and I think lots of local authorities have been contacting me, have been contacting other local authorities, have been doing innovative stuff around food space, because we are looking what actually works to tackle these really insurmountable issues. What I've said is actually in terms of support we can give, a lot of local authorities have been giving out vouchers, which are incredibly expensive during the holidays. By comparison, breakfast provision is incredibly affordable and cost effective in comparison with a lot of the other interventions which we can put in place. And so I think that the evidence is quite strongly there. I think it's just communicating it.
Brilliant, thank you, Marcus. Coming back to you actually again in terms of, I suppose, more practical advice, and I'm gathering from some of the questions that we've got quite a lot of individuals from local authorities who have joined us today, which is fantastic. What would be your kind of key advice on local authorities who are just starting out on this journey or thinking about starting out on this journey? And are you able to give any indication of the types of cost levels that they'd be potentially looking at to roll out something similar to what you've done in Hammersmith and Fulham?
Yes, so with schools, you need to obviously have a good relationship with the schools, listen to them. At the beginning, kind of my presentation kind of pointed out that it was slightly before I joined the local authority, we had an idea of what the model was going to look like. You can't really do that. It's a local authority just decide what the model is going to be, and that's why we created that flexible offer, which really listens to schools. In terms of costs, the actual cost of providing a breakfast in support of Magic Breakfast is under 30p per breakfast. We also provide an additional grant to schools as well to cover other costs, so it becomes around 50p per breakfast for us.
Brilliant, thank you. And another question that's come through, which I think brings us nicely back to where we started, which is with the Hidden Hunger Report and the analysis. And Pete, I'll come to you for this one, having been very intently kind of deep in work with the data and the findings from the report. Were there any surprises that came through for you from all of the analysis for the Hidden Hunger Report that you could share?
Yeah, I'm going to cheat and say probably two things that sort of really surprised me. The first one was, and I mentioned this in my presentation, where the pressures of funding breakfast provision are being borne. The fact that schools are taking on the majority of that cost themselves was a genuine surprise to me. The other thing was in barriers, which I think is quite interesting. So one of the things we found was that generally in areas with higher levels of deprivation, that cost was the primary barrier to breakfast implementation, and that made sense. What was quite interesting was that in areas with comparatively lower levels of deprivation, one of the main barriers that schools cited was lack of awareness of hunger. And I think that demonstrates in many ways the need for our model of making sure that there are support and challenge staff there to go into schools and to help them find that hunger. But to hear that, I think what was quite interesting. So yeah, I'd say those two.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm mindful of time and wanting to wrap up in a timely fashion. I think just picking up on a couple of other questions that have come through, and particularly around costing, and picking up on what Marcus said. I guess for clarity, so the Magic Breakfast model and our costing is 28 pence per breakfast per child. And what we are working very hard to do, and for some of you who maybe know about my time at Magic Breakfast, which is relatively recent, I joined at the end of November. And what we've been doing is reviewing our strategy, looking at how do we even further leverage that economies of scale? How can we absolutely understand the pressures on not just the public purse, but also on the charity and the private sector to some extent as we face this rising cost. And so we are looking at, how can we best target our provision to make sure that we're reaching as many hungry children and young people. And I think, again, going back to that real people-centered approach and data-led decision making, those are some of our key priorities that we're looking at the moment. And one question that came through, which I did answer live, but I'm never quite sure if it shows up properly in the actual thread, is do we operate in rural communities? And the short answer is yes, we do. A more detailed answer is that we are also actively exploring the potential to work in even more remote communities such as Scottish Islands, and understanding how we can best leverage local supply chains and existing providers and provide that advice, support, and ability to overcome the barriers, because we absolutely recognize as an organization, we hope and we believe we can bring two things to the challenge, which is our experience, advice, and guidance around how you remove barriers, how you increase pupil uptake, how you implement and introduce a successful, thriving, impactful breakfast provision. And we also provide obviously the nutritious food and delivery and support for the kind of more specific breakfast provision. So very welcoming of any queries and questions from audience members. We will, at the end of today, circulate the video, and we will have worked out, because we've been able to do so through YouTube, we will make sure that we add subtitles to that. So just to recognize every day is a learning day, and we recognize and celebrate opportunities to learn and get better at Magic Breakfast. So we will make sure that our webinars going forward include subtitles, and that the videos shared afterward do as well. We will, in the spirit of getting feedback and getting better, we will include in our email circulation afterward a survey, which we would ask that you do take the time, not much, but do take the time to fill in, and just again help us shape what these Magic Mornings include, what can be valuable to our partners, and what information and knowledge would you like us to, I suppose, convene and share And finally, last but very much not least, another thank you to Marcus, to Anne-Marie, to Keely, to Pete, to the brilliant Magic Breakfast team behind the scenes who have kept all of this flowing from a technical perspective very effectively. And just a huge thank you to everyone who's joined us. It is a very daunting challenge that we face at the moment, and we saw with yesterday's food strategy being announced that it's likely that the issue of child hunger is not going to go away anytime soon. It is going to get worse, as I think Marcus's slide captured really succinctly, unfortunately. But we are 100% committed to working alongside partners, collaborating to find ways to make it a bit better every single day and ensure that no child is too hungry to learn. So a very big thank you, and wish you a great rest of the day. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.